Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today is the second session of our two-part webinar series on mental health and IDD. In the chat box, please introduce yourself, tell us your name, where you're from, and why you've joined the conversation today. My name is Dr. Morgan Foster, and I am an assistant professor and extension specialist who oversees our Disability Community Coordinators Initiative. This initiative, led by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in partnership with the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities, or TCDD, aims to strengthen local, regional, and statewide extension efforts to connect individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families with valuable resources, education, and support across the state. There are disability community coordinators across the state, including my lovely team, Erin Fogarty of North Texas, Olu Motoni of East Texas, Rosa Gale of South Texas, Alexandra Venegas of Central Texas, and we also have our student aide, Deborah. Just some quick Zoom information. During the session today, all attendees' cameras and microphones are off. However, to communicate with our presenter and ask questions, you can utilize the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will also have time at the end of the session for questions and answers from the audience. Also, closed captioning is being provided through the Zoom live captioning feature at the bottom of your screen. You can toggle that on. So again, this is our second session of our mental health and IDD webinar series. The first session covered self-care and mental wellness for caregivers and direct support professionals. And today's session is on supporting your loved one's mental health, led by Mr. Charles G. Charles G is a mental health professional based in Dallas, Texas. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. As a licensed professional counselor and change agent, Charles has spent countless hours advocating and supporting populations in need. After leaving his career in higher education, Charles started his private practice, Cardinal Collective. Cardinal Collective was born from the idea that growth and healing are possible, especially when you have a community to support you. As a clinician, he ensures his clients feel supported and have a healthy and safe outlet to process life's struggles. Alongside his work with clients, he also facilitates workshops surrounding mental health and wellness for various businesses and organizations. Outside of work, he enjoys trying new foods, paddleboarding, roller skating, and spending time with his close friends and family. So thank you again for joining one more week, Charles, and we look forward to your presentation. And I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good day, wherever you may be. As mentioned, my name is Charles. I'm excited to be here with you today. And I know, this work is meaningful. And so my hope is that you're able to take in as much of this information as you can. I know that outside of the direct work that you do, that you may be managing a lot of information. And so I'm hoping that this information is applicable across many different aspects of your life, not just as a caregiver or someone who's in a direct support professional role. I also want to give a early disclaimer that we'll address some aspects of trauma and support that may be a little bit heavier, maybe than you anticipated. So I encourage folks to take time to take care of yourself today, even if that means stepping away for a minute or to engage in a way that's healthy for you. This presentation is for parents, it's for guardians, siblings, caregivers, educators, direct support professionals, so on and so forth, and just making sure that you are able to support that loved one in a way that is healthy for you and also for them. If you were with us last week, my hope is that you have been able to engage in some type of long-term self-care habits. And if not, please feel free to review that recording from last week, as I'm sure you will find it helpful. So I quickly want to address some of our learning objectives for today. So first, making sure that we understand emotional literacy and how it supports mental well-being across the board, recognize the effects of trauma and change on individuals with IDD, learning to build effective routines for emotional and behavioral just support across the board. And then lastly here, thinking about ways that we can apply daily strategies to support stability and wellness across the board. So, with a quick reflection, I want folks to engage in the chat. Who is top of mind as you engage with this presentation today, and what setting may be top of mind as you engage today? And so that way, I know and the audience knows kind of who's in the room with us today. When we understand the who or the why, it makes you engage so much more meaningfully as we do this work, as we reflect on this work. It gives us kind of a foundation of why we continue to do this work, why it matters to us, right? All right. Thank y'all for sharing. As you continue to put things in the chat, just kind of keep these people, these settings top of mind. I know that when I was in grad school, some of the material that I was looking at, sometimes I felt like it didn't resonate with it or I had to do it. And when I kept populations in mind, the people that I was working with directly, it made it a lot more digestible for me to hear it, to receive it, to engage with it across the board. So, with all of the people and the places that we're putting into the chat here, this is why this work is important, right? So before we take a deep dive into the content, I really want to take some time to highlight why the conversation is so important. Mental health is vital for all of us, but for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's oftentimes overlooked or and honestly simply misunderstood sometimes. Research shows us that people with IDD are slightly higher risk for mental health issues. According to the CDC, nearly 1 in 3 individuals with disabilities report frequent mental distress, which is about 5 times higher than adults without disabilities. And so this tells us that mental health needs are not only common in this population, but they're also urgent, right? There's also a high prevalence of dual diagnosis, meaning that, someone may live with both a developmental disability and also mental health condition like anxiety or depression and honestly, even PTSD. And we'll talk a little bit about PTSD towards the midpoint of our time together today. But here's the issue, those mental health concerns are oftentimes misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. And because symptoms are mistakenly attributed to the disability itself, right? So it becomes difficult for us to engage with it when we don't really know when we look what we are looking at. Excuse me. When these needs go unrecognized, individuals can face challenges in their relationships. They can face challenges in their learning environments, their own independence, and even physical health as well. Behaviors labeled as difficult may actually be signs of emotional distress. And when we don't address the root cause, we risk increasing that distress, right? So, how do we get to the root of the problem as well? So let's talk about some of the most common mental health challenges that individuals with IDD may experience. While these diagnoses are common across general populations, they oftentimes present differently amongst all of us, right? Even those without IDD. And sometimes it's harder to depict within people that have IDD as well. So anxiety being the first one, right? One of the most frequent observed concerns is anxiety. This can show up for us in a way that is, restlessness, maybe it's avoidance, repetitive behaviors, or also physical complaints about stomach aches or headaches. Because some individuals may not have the language to express their worries, it's important to look at the behaviors as a form of communication. Depression, right? Depression can also be present, but it may not always look like sadness. Depression may also look like changes in sleep. There may be changes in appetite or energy level or interest in preferred activities. For some, this can appear as increased irritability or individuals being withdrawn. With PTSD, it's often misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed in this population as well. Many of these individuals experience trauma, such as medical procedures, bullying, neglect. They may not have the language or cognitive framework to describe their experiences. And so instead, trauma may surface through regression, or even emotional shutdown. And so with that, it's important to discuss, the difficulty with emotional regulations as well, right? A lot of these challenges are connected to the difficulty with emotional regulation. This means that, there's someone somehow, some way struggling to manage, their intense feelings like anger or frustration or fear, to communicate what's going on. Understanding that, individuals with IDD haven't been explicitly taught how to identify or cope with their emotions, so they may act out or shut down when they're not taught these skills in a way that, helps them communicate better to the people that they are in connection with, right? And then lastly here, communication barriers, one of the biggest obstacles. If someone can't clearly express how they feel or what they need, it becomes very easy for symptoms to be misinterpreted or to be simply just overlooked, right? A behavior might be labeled as non-compliant or even aggressive when in fact it's rooted in distress or pain. Recognizing these mental health challenges and how they can look different in people with IDD is an important first step in providing appropriate support, right? So, as we are talking about this work, as we're doing these things, it's really helpful for us to take some time to recognize what's showing up, what might be some things that we need to do differently in order to better support and serve this population of folks. So, first, as one of the learning objectives is let's first discuss the emotional literacy component of it. And so I've, pulled together some things to define what that looks like. So it refers to the ability to recognize, understand, express, and manage one's own emotions and to recognize and respond to the emotions of others, right? It is the foundation for self awareness and emotional regulation. It helps us build healthy relationships, navigate social situations, and promote overall well being. For individuals with IDD, emotional literacy can be taught and strengthened through structured support, modeling, and interaction, intentional routines, right? So, really thinking about how do we build up, support over time. So now that we understand what it is at a foundational level, why is this difficult, right? They might experience some communication barriers, right? So, like I've just mentioned, many individuals with IDD experience communication barriers. That mean that they may experience being nonverbal or use alternative communication devices or speak in a way that's hard to understand. If someone can't communicate easily, they may have trouble expressing what they're feeling or even recognizing what they're feeling to begin with in the first place, or even trying to share what's going on within them internally. Emotions can become, trapped or misinterpreted and leading to frustration or behavioral outbursts that, many of them may be experiencing. Second, individuals with IDD can have limited emotional vocabulary. While many people might, describe emotions like feeling overwhelmed or disappointed or even lonely, someone with IDD might only use words like mad or sad, right? Or none of the above. So really thinking about if you don't have the words to describe your inner experience is extremely difficult to regulate or ask for support when you can't quite connect the language to those things. Lastly, and this is really important, some individuals have past experiences where their emotions were not validated. Maybe they were told to calm down, maybe they were told to stop being dramatic, maybe they were ignored or punished for expressing themselves. Over time, this teaches people to suppress or distrust their emotional responses, which makes emotional literacy even harder to develop, right? So really thinking about how a lot of emotional literacy and language that we use to describe may be limited or non-existent for folks a part of this population and really hard to express. So how do we help that? So the goal of it is to really think about how do we, think about positive behaviors, right? And I don't really like to say positive or negative or things like that, but how can we start to recognize what folks are feelings, whether it's frustration or sadness or excitement? They're more likely to respond in a healthy way. Without that understanding, those feelings may come through aggression or shutdowns or meltdowns, right? Giving someone the tools to name their emotions gives them, more control in their responses, right? Really thinking about how we can support them in that kind of way, right? It also reduces emotional distress, thinking about how hard it is to carry big feelings or not having the words to explain them. When individuals with IDD learn how to recognize and learn how to express their emotions, even in small ways, right? Even in small ways, it can prevent them from feeling overwhelmed, from feeling disconnected. It creates a sense of agency and it also creates a sense of calm, right? If we're able to show up and support and affirm what they are experiencing, they're a bit more seen, a bit more recognized, and a bit more validated in what they are experiencing. And lastly, emotional literacy improves communication, and also relationships. When we teach someone how to say, I'm angry instead of hitting, or I need a break instead of running away, we open up healthier ways to connect, right? Emotional literacy helps people feel seen, and helps people feel heard and understood, which ultimately strengthens the trust and connection that we have with the folks that we are in community with, right? The people that we're supporting, the loved one that we are there for. The goal of emotional literacy isn't just about labeling feelings, it's about empowerment, right? It's about helping individuals understand themselves and giving them the tools to connect with other people in ways where they feel safe, in ways that is respectful, and, that's something that we all can benefit from, right? So, really thinking about how do we give folks what they need? How do we take the time to first be curious before we accuse or before we assume, right? I know that oftentimes we ourselves can feel overwhelmed and not know what to do with our feelings, or we might feel frustrated, but how do we check in with ourselves first before we displace, our own emotions and our own feelings about what we're currently going through as we are supporting someone with IDD, right? So, as we're thinking about these things, I think it's important to really think about one of the models to understanding supporting emotional literacy is this framework here, right? The social emotional framework. So, for individuals with IDD, self awareness can start with something as simple as noticing when they feel off, right? Or learning to name their emotions with visuals or different types of prompts, whether that be through, using some online tools or some tactical tools that they can actually like physically touch, thinking about a way to increase their self awareness, even in the small ways, right? Self management, right? That's really about the ability to regulate emotions, manage stress, and staying motivated. It's a skill that takes time and practice, but it can be taught with consistency and support. And I want to kind of make that clear across the entire presentation today that this work that we do, it requires consistency, it requires support, it requires us to be diligent about how we are showing up in these spaces. For someone with IDD, social awareness might involve learning how to recognize other facial expressions, tones of voice, and also the need of personal space with people as well. Relationship skills, right? These can be developed through role play, guided conversations, and also modeling respectful interactions, right? The goal is to help individuals build strong, meaningful connections with others. And then lastly here, responsible decision making really involves making caring and constructive choices about behavior and social interactions. It also means for understanding consequences as well. So for people with IDD, this might look like using a first then choice board or practicing problem solving in low stressful situations. How do we build up, a certain skill set over time? So we've talked a little bit about a framework. We've talked about, the goal. We've talked about the difficulties with this. Here are some tools, right? So one of the tools that, is really helpful, I use this a lot across the board, is this feelings wheel. I just dropped that into the chat, but it's feelingswheel.com, and it is a wheel of emotions. I typically share with all of my clients for people that are, oftentimes struggling to identify what they are feeling, what they're experiencing. And the common misconception, for whatever reason, is that we can only feel one thing at a time, and that's just not true. And so we might experience a lot of different feelings around a lot of different things, or just one thing at all. I use this kind of as a starting point, and so, how do we look at that and see it and understand that what I'm feeling may not even be listed on here? And that in and of itself is a good place to start. So with any tool or skill that is being developed, we have to make sure that we are being consistent with it, right? So using these tools, so like I mentioned, the feelings wheel, maybe it's some emotional cards or flashcards or some visual aids. Maybe there's some zones of regulation, modeling the behavior and naming the behavior, right? I think that this is so important when we're working with any population, really, of modeling behavior that we are expecting folks to experience and do, right? So how do we name what we're experiencing? How do we name what we're seeing? Journaling or even drawing, storybooks or social activities, and then also just some emotional check-ins. The one thing I will say around emotional check-ins is the one thing that I've been saying since I started is consistency. So maybe that is developing a morning routine where we get to check in. Maybe that means that we get to do a nighttime check in around the emotions. How was the day on a scale of 1 to 5, or using these visuals? What was your experience with the day? What does that look like for you? Right. So instead of the asking the questions of how are you doing? Don't be afraid to ask, how are you feeling? Right? Making sure that they are responding with the feeling word. So we can say, the day was good or okay. And many of us, do that. But don't be afraid to, check in. Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper and ask about the emotion specifically, right? It's so easy to get, caught up in the hustle and bustle of the day in and day out where we say, oh, things are good, things are fine, and just checking in with ourselves too about the language that we use when we're being asked how we're doing or how we're feeling. So when we are asking the question and we're looking for an emotional response, how are you feeling today? What's coming up for you today? And not being afraid to even ask yourself that as well. If we can name the behavior, that will take us even further than what it would if we don't, right? So sometimes it looks like you might be frustrated. Am I correct? Can you tell me how are you feeling if I'm not correct, right? Having that emotional understanding builds emotional resistance. With this, are there any tools to support emotional literacy that you've used before that you might have found helpful that are not listed on the slide here? Are there other tools that folks have used? I'm kind of curious here. And if there's tools that you have used that are on the slide here, I would love for you to also include that as well. This is good. And so my hope is that, as you all are dropping in these resources, that other people are able to kind of just scroll through the chat and see what they are also using, what they could also potentially find helpful as well, in their own personal spaces too. So now I want to move forward. In the conversation today. But before we move forward, let's consider why trauma looks and feels different for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Many individuals with IDD face a lifetime of repeated medical procedures or caregiver changes or bullying, and a lot of times even abuse, right? These experiences don't just happen in the moment, they shape the brain and body in the ways that a person relates to the world at large. And so, wanting to take some time to just kind of understanding its impact. And we'll talk a little bit about, some traumatic experiences, common reactions, the impact. And so, again, if you find that you need to just kind of take a step away, you're more than welcome to do that. So before I jump into these experiences, I think it's important to say that trauma doesn't have to be huge or significant. There can also be acute trauma. Trauma also doesn't have to happen to someone directly. It can also be indirectly, right? It doesn't have to be this big, significant thing for it to actually be impactful, right? So when we talk about trauma in individuals with IDD, we're not just talking about one time events more times than not, right? Oftentimes it's repeated and ongoing given the circumstances. So individuals with IDD are at a higher risk of physical abuse, often because they rely heavily on others for care and may not be able to report what happened, right? This can occur at home. This can occur in schools and also even in care facilities as well. Even hospitalization, right? And medical procedures through, although doing this, can be as frequent or not frequent at all. More times than not, it's necessary. And so going through, medical procedures and even hospitalization, these can be traumatic experiences where communication is limited. Someone is speaking on your behalf, and it may feel like there is no emotional support at all, especially when communication is limited. And so it can make someone feel very isolated and alone and disconnected from folks. How do we even build up support even in these spaces, right? Bullying is also very common, unfortunately, especially in school and community settings. Often goes, unreported due to communication challenges. And over time, this definitely does damage the trust and self esteem within the person, how they connect with people, trying to build a sense of normalcy in their life, and how it makes them feel, can make them feel a bit disconnected, right? Caregiver turnover, right? This can feel like a repeated loss, right? If there's constant turnover for whatever reason, maybe that is insurance change, maybe that is career change for caregivers, maybe that is time and availability change. All of these things, do impact the individual and it disrupts the attachment that they had and it creates emotional instability. And that oftentimes is difficult because as they're developing a routine, as they're developing a sense of closeness, if these things are disrupted, it might be hard for them to feel stable in this kind of environment. And also changes in education, right? Like switching schools or being removed from inclusive settings can impact both their learning and also a person's sense of self-belonging as well. When these types of experiences happen repeatedly and across different environments, right? It's known as chronic or complex trauma, right? Without support, it can have long-term effects on how someone views themselves, others, and also the world at large, like I said earlier. And when we think about this, right, when we think about these traumatic experiences, I would venture to say that many folks are experiencing at least two of these at any given time, right? Maybe it's bullying in the school environment, and maybe it's a caregiver turnover, right? Maybe it's constant hospitalization or caregiver turnover or bullying in the schools. But really thinking about, how these traumatic experiences are happening across the board. And again, like I said, it's really important to know that the trauma that folks are experiencing, it doesn't have to be huge or significant. It can be small and still be impactful, right? And again, it doesn't have to happen to someone directly. It can also happen indirectly. So if they are seeing how other people are being treated, if they're seeing how those close to them are treating other folks, it definitely does shape and shift what's going on. So with these traumatic experiences and how they show up, some common reactions, right? Sometimes these reactions can be sudden and also unexpected, right? When an individual with IDD experiences trauma, they may not be able to say, I'm scared, right? Or I feel unsafe. Instead, trauma often shows up in behaviors. And if we're not looking through a trauma informed lens, we might miss it, right? We might mislabel it across the board. One of the most common signs is a sudden change in behavior, like I mentioned. And so this could look like aggression, right? Such as hitting or yelling or withdrawing or refusing to engage or isolating themselves from other people. These behaviors aren't necessarily random either. When you see the random behavior come up, be curious, right? Because it's not random. Really taking the time to question and think about, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Wait a minute, what happened here? How long has this been going on? Be curious, right? Oftentimes, this change in behavior is the person's best attempt to protect themselves, right? Or trying to express discomfort when they don't have the words. Another reaction is losing skills that they previously had. So that might toileting accidents or difficulty dressing themselves or needing help with daily tasks that they, used to be able to do independently. Trauma can also disrupt the brain's ability to access, and assess the learned skills that they have already developed before. Also, trauma doesn't just affect the emotion, it also affects the body as well. So you may see a change in sleep, frequent stomach aches, or just general fatigue. Stress and fear are sometimes expressed through physical symptoms when emotional language is not available. So when we begin to recognize, these reactions for what they are, which are signs of distress, we can respond with compassion instead of punishment and support healing instead of escalating harm. So how can we slow down, right? This is a thing that I talk about more times than not with all of the populations of folks that I work with. How do we slow down our process? How do we bring into consideration what we're doing, being present in the moment, and not overreacting and having a sense of ease and peace about us as we continue to engage with the work that we do and the people that we interact with? So allowing ourselves some time to really slow down, right? And really assess situations from a different lens. So when someone's experienced trauma, right, their brain and body immediately react in an effort to survive. It's a biological response designed to keep us safe. Understanding this helps us shift our perspective from what's wrong with them to what happened to them, right? What happened versus what's wrong with them, as if, they've done something that they shouldn't have done. How do we take it from a lens of understanding, right? So when the brain senses danger, whether it's real or perceived, it activates what we call fight, flight, or freeze response, right? A person might lash out, fighting, they may run away or avoid a situation, they might fight, or they may completely shut down and become unresponsive, freezing, right? These are all automatic survival responses, especially common in people with traumatic histories. With heightened senses, the brain becomes hyper alert to sights, sounds, and sensations, and an individual may start to feel overwhelmed. So someone, might seem easily startled, jumpy, or always on edge. The body is scanning and constantly looking to make sure that they're safe and checking out threats even in situations that appear to be calm, right? So when the brain is in survival mode, it shuts down functions that it doesn't necessarily need in the moment, right? So suppressing these non-essential functions like digestion, reasoning, or verbal communication as well. That's why someone might experience stomach issues, difficulty concentrating, or they're losing their ability to speak during or even after triggering events. This is sometimes why we see that people sometimes pee on themselves after such a traumatic event. It's because their brain has kind of shut down and moved, awareness to other areas. And then once we are truly in a calming environment, our brains and bodies starts to like come back on and come back into function. And for the last two here on the screen, because of the emotional centered part of the brain takes over, it becomes very hard to regulate emotions or make sense of what's happening. This is especially challenging for folks with IDD who may already struggle with emotional vocabulary or self-awareness. So this kind of goes back to the importance around the emotional literacy component and building up the skills and the tools through consistent and intentional work. It's important to, know that the brain-based responses are not bad, right? They are protective. The things that happen that our brain does, they're there to protect us, right? But when someone, stays stuck in survival mode, it can really impact their behavior. It can impact their learning. It can impact their relationships. So we have to work really hard to get people into a healthier state of living and not just in survival mode. So as caregivers and professionals, recognizing these signs allows us to respond with patience. It allows us to respond with flexibility and also providing support across the board as well. So with that, I want to talk about, now that we've discussed some of the traumatic effects, I want to shift into talking about how we can respond in ways that promote healing and safety, right? Trauma informed care is really about creating an environment and relationships where a person can feel seen, where a person can feel supported and also in control, right? First and foremost, always, always, always validate the person's emotions before trying to fix the situation, right? When someone is, dysregulated or scared, they don't need advice. They need to feel safe and understood. So saying simple phrases like, that was scary, huh? Or you're safe now, or let's do something that helps you feel calm. These statements can help ground a person and let them know that they are not alone in these situations, right? We also, always want to try to reduce stress in environments, right? This could mean turning down bright lights. It could mean lowering background noises or even giving a person the time and the space to decompress. Maybe that means even headphones as well. When we reduce sensory overload, we also reduce emotional overload too. So being mindful of the spaces that we're occupying with folks in order to help them regulate even more. Another powerful trauma-informed strategy is to offer choices, right? Even small choices like, do you want to sit over here? Do you want to sit over there? Gives folks a sense of control. And if we can combine that with predictability using clear routines or visual schedules so that the person knows what's coming next, this builds, connections and reduces the anxiety, right? So we have someone that we can connect to, that we can trust, that is there for us as our advocate. It helps us feel a little bit more calm in that space. We also want to avoid punishment-based behavior, right? Responses to things, remembering that what looks like defiance is oftentimes distress. Rather than saying stop that or taking something away from them, try to understand the feeling underneath the behavior, offering a calm alternative that keeps the focus on safety and connection as well. Um, how do we, I want to make sure that we can, establish some clear routines, right? And also some expectations too. Like I've said, predictability builds safety. So when someone knows what's coming next, it reduces the anxiety and also reactivity. As common as calming tools aren't rewards, but more so tools to help regulate, we want to make sure that they are always accessible across the board. This might include weighted blankets, fidget toys, noise canceling headphones, or even a quiet corner. When behavior seems confusing or disruptive, try to avoid judgment across the board, right? We might not fully understand what triggered the reaction, but your calm and compassionate presence can also still make a difference in the person. If a person's emotional distress becomes persistent or the behavior becomes unsafe to themselves or to others, it's time to seek additional support. So, this might involve reaching out to a therapist, behavior support specialist, or crisis team, even your own support team, right? Don't be afraid to ask questions and follow up as much as it's required. And lastly, if someone is expressing some form of suicidal thoughts or engages in self injury, please take it serious every single time. Collaborating with professionals to create a safety plan and being sure that you know the steps to take if an emergency arises. What does that look like? Right? What does that look like in practice? Sometimes it's helpful to actually go through those things with your team of folks, right? So having a calm and non-alarming approach in critical situations is helping the person also feel safe. It helps them get regulated and getting the right help when it is necessary. So with that in mind, I really do want to know, are there other best practices that people are using that I have not listed? Or the things that you all are doing that are trauma informed best practices across the board? Yes, make sure that they're involved in the decisions. I cannot like echo the sentiment enough because sometimes it can feel like, oh, it's just easier if I do it. Now, as a person that is not a part of the community, I would feel robbed if someone came into my space and just started making decision for me, right? And so, how do we involve them in the process? How do we give them choice, agency, and also information about what's happening? And also, I think too, regardless of age, making the communication with the individuals age appropriate as well. So just because they're young, just because they may not, you think that they may not understand, making sure that we're still involving them in the process as well. So with these best practices, have you seen changes, or are there things that you're doing um, that works, or things that you're using that don't work? And I'm kind of just reading through some comments here. Developing keywords. Yes. Calming settings. Absolutely. So really thinking about, what's in your toolbox, right? And are you able to maintain a Rolodex, if you will, of supports, best practices to help keep, things calm, to keep things even in a way that says, I'm here to support, I'm here to help navigate all of these things. So, as we kind of wrap up these trauma informed best practices, I want to go into this last portion here around establishing routine. We've spent some time exploring trauma and how, some of these best practices can support healing. One of the most effective ways we can reduce distress and promote emotional safety is by creating some structure in daily life. Right. This brings us to this next topic. So for individuals with IDD, routines are more important, and they're not just habits. They're foundational for stability. They're foundational for trust and also self-regulation as well. Again, predictable routines help reduce anxiety and prevent behavior from escalating, and create some sense of safety after time of distress. And so in this next section, we'll look at how building meaningful and flexible routines that support both the emotional wellness and daily functionings for youth. Again, why does this matter? Routines aren't just helpful; they're essential for essentially all individuals with IDD who may be navigating trauma, right? Predictability creates that safety again. So when someone knows what to expect, their brain can legitimately relax, right? Especially if they've experienced trauma before. Routines lower anxiety by removing uncertainty and support self regulation by helping the body and the brain stay in sync, right? They also build a sense of control, which is empowering for individuals who often have little to say, have little say in their day-to-day lives, right? So ultimately routines aren't just about structure, they're about safety, they're about stability and supporting the emotional wellness of the individual as well. Creating some supportive routines. Now that we understand why they're important and why they matter, let's talk about, what supportive routines actually look like in everyday life, especially for these folks, right? Routines don't have to be rigid, right? But they need to be consistent, intentional, and person centered. Helpful routines might include visual daily schedules, predictable hygiene and meal times, emotional check-ins, like I mentioned earlier, whether that's first thing in the morning, before they go to bed, or even at nighttime as well. Maybe there's some color coding tasks, bedtime and wake up routines, and first then boards to show what's happening now and then what's coming up next. These tools, really do create clear expectations and reduce anxiety and offer a sense of control. And while routines are important, change is inevitable, right? It is going to happen. Sometimes we can't avoid it. So, how do we best prepare for it, right? So, to support transitions, introduce changes gradually, right? Building up that awareness first, then, talk about moving into the task change itself. For example, preparing someone for a new caregiver with photos and conversations can make the shift feel a little bit more safer, and giving them a little bit more knowledge around what's happening, who's coming into the space before the change actually comes into effect, right? Supportive routines ground and empower. They help the individual feel more confident, calm, and in control, even in the world when the world around them feels uncertain and unsafe, right? So These are, simple but powerful coping tools that can help individuals, regulate their emotions and feel more grounded throughout the day, right? Things like a calming corner or weighted blankets, movement breaks, music, noise canceling headphones, like I mentioned, sensory fits, all of these things, help them regulate, right? It also helps them create and, establish some level of joy and excitement in their life as well. And so I'm curious, are there other routines or coping tools that you've used before that you deem as your go-to now? Are there things that you've used before that you deem as your go-to? Feel free to drop those into the chat. But with these things here, really thinking about having again a Rolodex of coping skills and tools that can be useful. The one thing that, or the two things that, have produced good results, making sure to keeping those things there available and supportive for the folks that are in the space. And so I want to just kind of transition into the last portion today and just talk generally about just some key takeaways from our time together today. As we wrap up, really thinking about the emotional literacy component, right? Emotional literacy doesn't develop on its own, it must be modeled and supported, right? Trauma and transitions can deeply impact behavior, and our role to it is to respond in ways that restore safety. And then routines and moments of joy are not just helpful, they are also essential for mental and emotional stability. And finally, predictable routines, does truly, reduce the anxiety and help our loved ones, feel more safe, feel seen, and more secure in their daily lives as well. When we support, someone with IDD, advocacy is key across the board. Be sure to seek out trauma-informed providers who understand both the emotional and also the developmental needs, right? Don't hesitate to request for behavior health assessments, or if you've noticed changes in moods, to advocate and ask the questions and staying engaged with the work. And remembering, different state agencies often have valuable resources and services that can help, you access support in order to better support your loved ones as well, in the way that they deserve, in the way that they can show up. Lastly, here, I wanted to provide you all with some resources that I have found helpful and supportive, just with supporting folks with IDD, and I've dropped those into the chat for you as well. And they'll also be available in the presentation too. But just checking out a couple of different resources that may be helpful for you, whether that is different, national organizations, government organizations, or just even local agencies as well that you can engage with. And then lastly, the closing activity here, I am curious, what strategies or tools are you most interested in trying with your loved one and why? In what ways can you create safer, more emotionally supportive environments? And what do you need to make this change consistent throughout your experience? And this is not necessarily something that I want you to answer in this moment, but something that I really just want you to just kind of reflect on during our time together today and even beyond our time together today. Um, Thank you all so much for engaging with this. I want to transition now into the Q&A section to see if there are any questions that I may be able to answer generally here. So to Perla's point here about, remaining calm in difficult situations, we also have to develop a support system for ourselves as well, right? So when we feel dysregulated, when we feel like we may not be able to keep calm, who are our go-to people to help us navigate these situations, that we can share some of our raw emotions with, before engaging, and what kind of protective factors that we need to kind of build in place if we're not able to go to our safety zones, if you will, our safe people where we can just be honest with in the time of need. All right. If nothing else, I want to one say thank you all for being here. I really have truly enjoyed being here and engaging with this work. If you could be so kind, please take our survey. This will help us gather some information to continue to provide you with presentations that are helpful and relevant to the work that you do. It's important that we get this feedback to make sure that we can continue to engage with you all. So please complete the survey. And let's stay and get connected. Again, my name is Charles. I really do appreciate your time, your attention, and focus here today. My hope is that you were able to engage and take something away from our time together today. I just dropped my information into the chat, and I'd like to turn it back over to the team.
Thank you so much, Charles, for your very insightful presentation and so much information and strategies and tools for everyone to be able to add to their toolkit. So we really appreciate it. While we're still here, if y'all have any questions, again, feel free to drop those in the chat. Feel free to make sure you fill out that evaluation link at the very end of the eval link if you want to receive a certificate for participating in today's webinar for any like professional development needs. You can access that. So be sure to complete the entire eval form, and then the recordings for this presentation and the one last week will be made available soon on our TCDD website. And so for everyone who has registered, you will receive follow-up information for the recording link, as well as the slide deck as well. And Olu just dropped again the session materials, and so you have access to the presentation slides that were shared today. Oh, it looks like we do have a question in the Q&A. Yadira, could you let us know where you're located and we could chat more about why those youth that you're working with are not qualifying for the YES waiver? I know the eligibility criteria is a little stringent, but we could talk in Austin. Okay, send us an email and we can follow up with you. I'll drop my email in the chat, but we can follow up with you about the youth that you're working with who haven't qualified. Okay. And there was a lot of really helpful information dropped in the chat today, too. There's a lot of upcoming webinars. There were websites shared. And then I do not want to mispronounce your name, but Nazanin just mentioned that they are working to improve prenatal healthcare for people with IDD and are looking for healthcare professionals. And so they're conducting interviews as well. And so you can reach out to her. The QR code is there.
I just put it back on the screen.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Any other questions? And thank you, professionals, for sharing your tools that you use on a daily basis, too.
Yes.
And if y'all have ideas for future topics, please share those as well, because we hope to continue conversations around this topic area. Okay. Well, thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day and week and summer, and we look forward to staying with you all. Thanks again, Charles.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.